Robert Stone survived the turbulent 60s to scribe such neo-Conradian novels as The Hall of Mirrors, Dog Soldiers, Children of Light, and Outerbridge Reach. Most recently, he has devoted himself to the craft of the short story and penned such dark visions as Miserere, a story about a morally conflicted Christian who sets about the task of rescuing the souls of aborted fetuses. Miserere is one of the stories collected in Stone's latest book, Bear and His Daughter. On October 25, 1996, Robert Stone visited the Writers' Institute in Albany.
I think we need stories because just in the same way that we need, the waking mind requires dreams. We have to refine experience. We have to try and make it mean something, and the only way we can make it mean something is to compose narratives that are somehow productive of insight. I mean, that's what jokes are, for example. I mean, we have jokes. I mean, because in a way we need them. There's something necessary about them, and all jokes are about how it is. I mean, the punchline of every joke is a kind of, however absurd it is, it's a kind of a forced recognition. And when you laugh at a joke, what you're laughing at is a recognition of how things are. There is no narrative in things. I mean, things are we're just out here, and there really isn't any narrative. And it is up to human will and human ingenuity to compose all this into a narrative.
I know. I think I always wanted to write. I got fascinated with of all things. With radio narrative. I listened to the radio when I was a kid, and I really loved radio narratives. I mean, the old detective stories on the radio. And I also read, but I was fascinated by that. And I used to sort of walk around being my own radio and telling myself my own adventures when I wasn't, sort of like Sam Spade dictating his latest adventure to his secretary, Effie. But I was reading all the time, but I was just nuts over stories. All children are, but I think some children, lose it a little bit. They move off in other directions. Technical things absorb them. They get fascinated by what kind of car is what kind of car, and tools or things like that. Some kids just get fascinated by that sort of stuff. They get more into the present. I mean, they're still, they're just as intelligent as as the sort of bookish kids, perhaps, but they go in different directions. Other kids just cleave to stories, very often because they're not very happy with the lives they're having to live, and they're looking for escape chutes. I mean, we all are at one time or another, but some kids are always looking for, to somehow beam themselves somewhere else.
What was the first story you wrote?
Well, the first story I wrote was I was probably in about the 4th or 5th grade, and it was probably something. I mean, the first one I can remember was something. It was kind of an interplanetary trip to Mars. I think it's the same. Everybody writes the same story, or it used to be in my generation anyway. It was going to Mars.
I wasn't precocious. It really took me a while to begin to write, to get the organization. I mean, I was a guy who did tend obviously to quit things, and I always carried the book around with me, assuming that I would never finish it, that I would spend the rest of my life writing this one book, as many of my friends did. But one day, to my astonishment, I finished it, and I really owe that to Mac and to Stanford and so forth. I mean, Stanford was a mixed bag. I mean, in many ways, it provided the organization for which enabled me to write it, but it also provided me with considerable disorganization, being in California in the early 60s. I wouldn't have missed it for the world, but it probably set the writing of that book back a couple of years. But it was great fun, and the book got done. And having done the first one, you know, I then realized, to my horror, that there was nothing to do but write another one, since this was all I knew. And that's kind of what I've gone on doing, trying to speed things up a little on theory that life is only so long. I liked the early 60s better than I liked what happened in the late 60s, because it was, I mean, you know, the late 60s had a lot of unfortunate stuff. I mean, by then people were beginning to, beginning to die, beginning to, I mean, the early 60s were very, California was very sweet in the early 60s. It was very, very sweet. It was a place, that seemed to be a paradise with no snakes. And about the weirdest and strangest thing around was us, which was fine. We were really pretty harmless. Nobody knew what what LSD or peyote was. Nobody had a clue. Nobody knew what was with us. When we staged one of our midnight lion hunts on the golf course. The local cops were always trying to figure out, every time there was a full moon, there'd be the sound of these African drums, coming from the golf course, and we'd do our best to render our own homespun Maasai chants and play our drums, and we'd have a lion, somebody would be a lion. And one time the cops came, and often the cops came, and sometimes we made our escape, and sometimes they almost got this guy named Roy Seaburn, who was being the lion, except at the last minute he climbed a tree. He was so into being a lion, he just scurried up a tree. And the cops walked around with their flashlights, they couldn't find anything. And one time they just discovered Faye Kesey, looking at her most Madonna-like, just sort of sitting there with a little baby on her lap. And she couldn't explain anything. She had no explanations to offer, so they just left her alone. After we'd been there about a year, I remember this party that was celebrating the end of his completion of Sometimes a Great Notion. And the party was held in Perry Lane, and I can't do justice to what this party looked like, except to say that at least 3 of the Grateful Dead, the people who were later to be known as the Grateful Dead, were playing music there. And it was the first and last only attempt at making a human cat's cradle that I've ever seen. Everybody was arrayed on the floor attempting to compose themselves into a cat's cradle, but things were getting very disorderly because, so I remember someone trying to interpose a little order there, and I remember them saying, "Now, all the thumbs raise their hands." So, I mean, that was kind of what it was like. And I will say it was a great party, but it was that marked Kesey's kind of departure from ordinary fiction to to life, and from metafiction to meta life. But things were getting very sinister. We were visited by this Mexican federal policeman who announced that he was agent number 1. He showed us a badge. Indeed, it's numero uno. I mean, he was agent number 1. Estados Unidos de Mexico. And in those days, I mean, we had not yet interested the Mexicans or the Mexican police particularly in drugs. We hadn't started our campaign. So he was just kind of sounding us out. And he decided to get us drunk and make us talk. And so he took us to this little roadside cantina, which was about the only thing there, where now there are, luxurious lounges overlooking the sea. But and pretty soon he got himself completely shit-faced. And we tried to buy a round of drinks, and he got pissed off. I'm the only one who buys. You know, I'm agent number one. When Elizabeth Taylor lost her jewelry up in Puerto Vallarta, you know, they came to me. And nobody gives me any shit. And anybody's drinking, I buy the drinks. And, you know, and I'll tell you this, you know, it's a crime to smoke marijuana. I don't know whether you people smoke marijuana or not, but it's a crime to smoke marijuana. But if you have a little marijuana for your personal, you know, for your personal use, you know, that's something that could be worked out. Do you have a little marijuana for your personal use? No. No, we don't have any marijuana for our personal use. But things were getting very sinister. I mean, nobody was terribly popular there. I got the sense of what the local feeling was when every time the bus went by, people blessed themselves. I thought that probably boded ill.
Miserere is a very hard story. It's hard on the reader. It's a hard story to write. But I mean it to represent paradox. It's neither a pro nor an anti abortion story. I mean it is about really how people cope, and in this case, it's one woman who, in a way, has a love-hate relationship with God. And she kind of, she calls the church on its teaching, and she calls God on his commandment. I mean, in a defiant, angry way. I mean, she observes the letter of the law, and I mean it to contain certain truths about religion and observance, and truths also about grief and loneliness and legalism. So I don't think people will go away from it depressed. I think, I don't expect them to, I don't think it'll put a bounce in their step, but I don't think it'll, ruin their day either. I think it'll be a good experience rather than a bad one. 13 years before, on the lake outside Boston, on the second evening before Christmas, her husband had taken the children skating. First, young Charlie had wanted to go, and Charles had demurred. He'd had a few drinks. Then he had agreed in his shaggy, teasing, slow-spoken way. He was rangy, raw, a Carolina Scot like Mary. It was almost Christmas, and the kids were excited, and how long would it stay cold enough to skate? Then Peyton had demanded to go, and then finally little Emily, because Charles had taught them to snap the whip on ice the day before. And the lake, surrounded by woods, was well lighted, and children always skated into the night. Although there was one end, as it turned out, where the light failed, a lonely bay bordered with dark blue German pine, where even then maybe some junkie had come out from Roxbury or Southie or Lowell or God knew where and destroyed the light for the metal around it. And Emily still had her cold and should not have gone. But they went, and Mary waited late, and sometimes listening to music, having a wild turkey, she thought she heard voices sounding strange. She could remember them perfectly now, on the point where she began to doubt so faintly that the cries were in fun. The police said he had clung to the ice for hours, keeping himself alive and the children clinging to him, and many people had heard the calling out but taken it lightly. She was there when the thing they had been was raised, a blue cluster wrapped in happy seasonal colors, woolly reindeer hats and scarves and mittens, all grasping and limbs intertwined, and it looked, she thought, like a rat king, the tangle of rats trapped together in their own naked tails and flushed from an abandoned hull, to float drowned, a raft of solid rat on the swells of the lower Cape Fear River. The dead snarls on their faces, the wild eyes, a paradigm she had once seen as a child, she saw again in the model of her family. And near Walden Pond, no less, the west wind slept on the lake, eyes glimmered in the silver dusk, a dusk at morning. She had lost all her pretty ones.
What is beautiful in the world is a recognition. The only salvific element in the world is insight. And insight is the recognition of truth. I mean, that is really all we have. It's the only thing we have to get us by. It's this process of recognizing truth, which can be hard, but is you know, is satisfying. It's why you know, in a way, it's why a story like this, like some of the stories in this, you know, in this collection, which are rather grim. I mean, some of them are funny, but some of them are pretty grim, and the novels too. I mean, but I don't mean them to make people depressed. I really mean people to get a kind of lift out of them. You know, as odd as that may sound, but you know what I mean.
It's like the solace of knowledge.
Right, and catharsis, the solace of knowledge, the solace of insight, that you somehow, you know, it makes the world less lonely. It makes, you know, the fact that, you know, the shared insight is something that makes the world less lonely. And anything that makes the world less lonely makes it less, you know, frightening and more livable.
Monsignor Danilo smiled his lupine smile. And when Mary had set the babies down before the altar, he took her hand in his. In the past, he sometimes kissed it. Tonight, he pressed it to his breast. The intrusion of his flabby body on her senses filled Mary with loathing. He paid no attention to Camille Innamorato, and he did not introduce the server. "Ah," he said, bending to lift the curtain under which the creatures lay. "The little children, no?" She watched him regard the things with cool compassion, as though he were moved by their beauty, their vestigial humanity, the likeness of their Creator. But perhaps she thought he had seen ghastly sights before and smiled on them. Innocent as he might be, she thought, he was the reeking model of every Jew-baiting clerical fascist murderer who ever took orders east of the Danube. His merry countenance was crass hypocrisy. His hands were huge, thick-knuckled to the hands of a brute, as his face was the face of a smiling Cain. "So beautiful," he said. Then he said something in his native language to the slovenly young man, who looked at Mary with a smirk and shrugged and smiled in a vulgar manner. She did not let her gaze linger. Afterward, she would have to hear about Danilo's mother and her trip to behold the apparition of the Virgin in some Bessarabian or Balkan hamlet, and the singular misfortunes historically unique of Danilo's native land. And she would have to give him at least $75, or there would be squeals and a disappointed face. And now something extra for the young man, no doubt an illegal alien, jumped ship and saving his pennies. Camille Innamorato breathed through her inhaler. Father Danilo took a cruet from the pattern and with his thick fingers sprinkled a blessing on the lifeless things. Then they all faced the altar and the Eastern crucifix that hung suspended there. They prayed together in the Latin each knew. Agnus Dei qui tollis peccata mundi, miserere nobis. Finally, she was alone with the ancient thing, before whose will she still stood amazed, whose shadow and line and light they all were. The bad priest and the questionable young man and Camille Innamorato, she herself, and the unleavened flesh fouling the floor, adoring, defiant, in the crack house flicker of that hideous consecrated half-darkness, she offered it its due by old command. Lamb of God, who takest away the sins of the world, have mercy on us.
You know, you can sometimes with one line and one gesture, certainly with a line, make a character who is at least for the purposes of the story memorable. I mean, at least memorable enough for the purposes of a short story. It doesn't take much. It just takes a characterizing line. You can establish the character in very, very, with the minimum with a minimum of words. And I think the minimum is always best. I mean, I don't regard myself as, quotes, a minimalist, that I really, like to color in the landscape and all that. But it doesn't take much to establish a character when you learn how to do it. You can make, you get the voice, you get a sense of the interior and the sound of the voice, you get a little glimpse of the interior life, and a sense of the aura of the person. It's like making a piece of music in a way. It's like making a leitmotif, and the person then has a sound. I mean, it's all made out of language anyway. So that person has a sound. And if you were to bring that person back, you know, it would be like repeating a leitmotif, you know, in music. I think so. It's, you know, it's possible to do it with just, you know, a simple utterance and simple action.
A novel you can kind of meander, and you know, you write it in. You know, it's not surprising that the 19th century novel, for which I conceived a great, a tremendous admiration and fondness, and tried, you know, which I tried to emulate when I began to write. It's no surprise that those 19th century novels appeared as serials, you know, in sequence, because you really sometimes get the sense in, you know, that the writer doesn't really have a clue what's going to happen next, but he's going to, and you know, there are days when I feel I don't have a clue what's going to happen next, but in a novel I can, you know, I can just I can go over to another character, I can freewheel, I can go back and forth. I mean, you have a lot of freedom in a novel, but a story is, you know, a story is like a pitch. I mean, it lasts that long, and it's got a break. I mean, a good story is like, it's like a good pitch. It's like pitching a strike, and it lasts about that long, and it's got to have that English, you know. It's got to have that curve on it, and you know, and when it's and I mean, and it ends with that kind of smack in the catcher's glove, and that's a good short story. I mean, it's that simple. It's one long motion, one long line that ends in the catcher's glove.
I know who the people are, and I know their situation. I usually know the ending. I know what I'm going for. I know a couple of principal things that are going to happen, and I know how it's going to end. And what I'm groping for always is sort of the second act. I mean, I have certain waypoints that I'm moving toward, and I try to give the thing an accelerating pace so that it seems to move faster as you go farther in it, and you get drawn toward the ending. And I try and order the principal events so as to make the pace as fast as possible. I'm going to turn to novels, I think, at this point, if I ever get through the one I'm working on, that are less plotted, that rely less on plot than some of the novels I have written in the past, that are, you know, that are more simple and maybe more direct, and have to do with, you know, concerns of mine that I think I can deal with in a more simple structure. I think writing more stories has kind of taught me that. I think I've learned from I did 3 stories last year, and I think I learned a lot from writing stories. I always feel like I'm learning how to write short stories. And I think from the short story, which is a very difficult form, you know, I think you learn economy. And I would like to make my novels shorter and more direct and more impacted and less plotted than they have been in the past after this next one. I have to kind of hallucinate myself into the scene I'm trying to write. I guess I'm vaguely aware that, you know, I'm doing something that, you know, a lot of people have done before, but I'm not. I'm really focusing on what I'm, you know, on the world of imagination. I really do. It takes on a tremendous reality for me. I mean, I can get really quite lost in, you know, and immersed in the character's world. Like it's one of the. I think that's how a lot the minds of a lot of writers work. I mean, they used to say of Dickens that somebody called him a halluciné. That he you know, I mean, I can. I always had a very, you know, strong imagination. I mean, from the time I was a child. I mean, I think part of writing, and this is not exactly to address the question of, you know, a dialogue with forebears, but I think there's a level on which you have got to never quite gain adulthood. You have to keep a certain part of, a childlike capacity for losing yourself in imagination, for spacing out. I mean, something I always could do when I was a child. I mean, people were always going, hey, wake up, where are you? And I mean, that was important to me to kind of escape into fantasy.
The only juvenilia I ever found was a letter that I wrote when I was about in the 7th grade. And I can see certain things there that are the way I write, that were there then. I wonder how much that a trip to Mars is like Missouri. I'm sure, there are things in it that are the same, and points of view and notions that are the same. I wonder how much I've learned since then.
And he introduced me by saying quite incorrectly that at Christmas Eve at the Albert Hall, when the Beatles entertained, I sort of interrupted the proceedings by singing Deutschland über alles, which since our venue was the YMHA, did not go over terribly well. It didn't. I mean, it's not true. I mean, what I was singing was the Internationale, but Ken doesn't know the Internationale from Deutschland über alles,
But you did interrupt the Christmas Eve concert.
Yeah. But, yes, the acoustics were great too at the Albert Hall.